Little musical chairs for everyone. There we go. Okay, we all right? My name is Ben Maku. I am a national security reporter with Vice in New York City. I've covered terrorism now probably since 2013 or so. It's expanded to not just include ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but I now look at far right-wing terrorism, white nationalists, neo-Nazis, which are also emerging right now. And this particular panel will be about sort of the end of the Caliphate, or the territorial holdings of ISIS, and what effect it's going to have on terrorism in Europe and in North America. So we have Olivier Guitta from GLOBSEC, Manuel Navarrete from Europol, Meredith Stricker, Meredith Stricker, and Kasper Reykjavik from GLOBSEC. And sorry, I missed, you are from the Sufan Group Center. So to start things off, I wanted to ask Manuel, since you're with Europol, what is the threat facing Europe right now in terms of the fall of the Caliphate? And what are you seeing?
I think right now at Europol, along with the member states, we are assessing if we are at the end of the cycle. I mean, this phenomenon of so-called foreign terrorist fighters start in 2012, 2013. They have a peak, we speak about security, in 2015, 2016, and latterly, thanks to the cooperation that we have, in this case in Euro, at the member state level, is going down. We reinforce the information exchange, we reinforce the analysis, and then we're able to identify earlier to detect these attacks and eventually to mitigate the effects of the attacks. Right now, we are facing how this is impacting the fall of the physical caliphate, what's the threat evolving from the groups that we had before, the dispersion that we have seen now in Iraq and Syria, and also in the north of these countries. And in the meantime, how live is the virtual caliphate? Because, I mean, the propaganda machine of ISIS, also Al-Qaeda, but especially ISIS, was very active. One of the evidence that we have that still can try to regain some activity and to provoke some attack is connected to the social media propaganda machine. This is why we are looking into two different dimensions. One is the physical caliphate connected to foreign fighters, connected to radicalization and incitement of provoking attacks inside European Union territory. And in the meantime, how live is the virtual caliphate in order to mitigate also the actions coming from this propaganda machine in order to provoke attacks in the European Union soil.
I want to ask Olivier a question about, I mean, you've been involved recently discussing how there's going to be a lot of jihadists coming out of prison in Europe. Right. What effect is that going to have? Not just the foreign fighters who are coming back, but now we're having this new wave. This is also something we're seeing in the United States. I mean, I think it was last week or the week before, John Walker Lindh, American Taliban, came out of prison. And this is one early wave of jihadists, but now they're coming out. How is that going to affect things?
Security services in Europe are extremely concerned about the release in the next 18 months of 500 dangerous jihadists that they will have to monitor 24/7. And remember, the main issue that security services have is problem and lack of means. For every single jihadist that they have to follow 24/7, follow their social media, they need 30 officers. So if you throw them another 500 that are potentially deemed dangerous, they're going to be overextended. And already, I can assure you that security services have to make choices because they have to, time and again, pick the person they think will most probably carry out an attack. And so they've been extremely good. I'll take on the point of Manuel. Yes, in a way, for us all, the threat has gone down, but not for security services. We're still even higher in the number of plots foiled today than we were 3 years ago. We're talking about at least once a month in the UK, close to 2 a month in France. So security services have really learned from the experience of the attacks of 2015 to clamp down and be extremely more effective with cooperation to the level that it wasn't there. So yes, it's a huge issue, but down the road, and what's been since 2001, the main problem for security services is the guys that they don't have on the radar. So the attack in Lyon last week is extremely concerning for them, Because this guy, Algerian student, was not fiché S, so he was not on the terror watch list, contrary to most of the people that we've seen with a GLOBSEC study that were on that list. And the guy basically wanted to carry out an attack just before the European election to make Marine Le Pen more powerful and basically to steer a kind of civil war.
And that's something I was going to mention was, you know, I know Rukmini Callimachi of the New York Times has been really great about making this a point, that the number of attacks attempted has not changed by ISIS since about 2015. The difference has been security and intelligence services have been better at thwarting it. Katzber, I want to ask you, GLOBSEC just did a great report on foreign fighters from Europe, and I get this question all the time in terms of everyone just wants a simple answer. What is an ISIS fighter? Who are they? And it's obviously very broad and complex, but that's why I'm going to throw you this question.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yes, so if you can briefly summarize, tell me, who are the ISIS fighters that were there that left to go fight for ISIS and Al-Qaeda?
It's a kind of like a question which pushes me towards a kind of like a statistical, mathematical answer, and I love, you know, providing such answers, like saying the answer is 7, and then, you know, go figure what that means. In this sense, it's easy to give you a kind of like a snapshot, but I mean we have to look behind the snapshot. So I'll kind of like, you know, in two sections, if I may. First is that, okay, you know, I'm gonna give you the I guess the obvious: male, late 20s, early 30s. So it's not teenage rebellion. 87-13 males versus females. We're looking at people who quite often, and our French team who's present here in the room actually was pushing this in the reports, that people who are actually in-betweeners, they're hybrids. So on one hand, they come from areas in which people who move in packs, I wouldn't say gangs, do things together, stuff together. And this stuff could be football, could be crime, could be, well, basketball is probably less likely, but you get my point. But then it could as well be terrorism. So you've got, you know, you have people you have a huge constituency of people who are not committed religiously. Let's put it this way. Although many of them are, and I don't want to discount Gilles Kepel's point about, you know, radicalization in places like that. But you've got a huge community of people who are also thugs. That's Olivier Roy for you. But then you have a community of people who are in between. And, you know, we see those hybrids. So I would say, in a nutshell, I wouldn't like to go down the path of like this, and that. The person is a hybrid. In between things, moving, in between communities, in between, I wouldn't say jobs, but actually a bit of this and a bit of that. And a bit of this and a bit of that, in our case, the majority of the modality of our project was that we're looking at the criminal connections. And yes, I would love to say that there is a crime-terror nexus, yes, and to some extent it does exist, but I would say it's a slightly different take. Many of Europe's terrorists are former criminals, but they're not necessarily use the criminal proceeds or the criminal know-how in their terroristic activities. So, you know, we gotta make that clear. Let's abandon, or sometimes, you know, be a bit more critical towards this kind of a cliche. But I mean, in one word, they're hybrids.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at someone like Zarqawi, for example, he was a criminal. He went to jail. He had tons of tattoos. He cut them all off himself. Joined Al-Qaeda, and it kind of went from there. And the same thing goes for. I know in Canada there were some individuals I was in touch with who were there who were part of ISIS. They were a group of 5 friends. They all went to the same Musala, and then they all went over to Iraq and Syria together. So there's this sort of grouping going on. And I would add, you know, it is quite often young men, unfortunately. Meredith, I wanted to ask you, what about all the people that are over right now in Kurdish camps, both men, women, and children? What humanitarian crisis is facing them?
And are you talking about foreigners?
Foreign fighters that have been captured by the KRG.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to GLOBSEC for the invitation, my first GLOBSEC conference. I'm thrilled to be here. You know, our perspective on this organizationally is unequivocal. States need to repatriate their citizens. They need to take them back, and they need to arrest them and or provide services to them because that's their responsibility. These people are their citizens. They're being held in unstable prisons or camps that are prison-like. We have a generation of children, many of whom haven't been to school in, say, 5 years. And so this is a humanitarian issue, but it's a security issue. Because if you leave those people there, if they're not tried in a kangaroo court in Iraq that may or may not actually be accurate about what they've done and sentence them to death or to something else, I mean, it's possible that they're getting a fair trial there. It's unclear, but for the ones held in Syria, not only are the SDF not a government that can actually adjudicate, any of those claims, but we are reinforcing the narrative, the incredibly powerful ideology of you do not belong, which is, and not to put too fine of a point on what Casper said, but there must be a sense of belonging that was absent for that pilgrimage to take place in the first place. So the long-term solutions are complicated, they're expensive, they're labor-intensive, they don't fit into an election cycle. It's a really hard political sell to take people back, but it is necessary for our security. So I'll just say quickly, many of you may know that Osama bin Laden's citizenship was revoked. He wasn't allowed to go back to Saudi Arabia, and he formed Al-Qaeda in Sudan. And many of the original cadre of Al-Qaeda were people whose citizenship was either revoked or they knew that they would face death if they went home, so they didn't go back. And so we see that creating citizens of the Islamic State is what we're doing by not taking our citizens back.
Yeah, I mean, you had that whole Egyptian contingent, Zawahiri. This was somebody who couldn't go back to Egypt. They all went and made it a much more violent organization because of it. One thing I wanted to mention to the audience as well is you don't have to just listen to me ask questions. You can ask questions on Slido, so I'll be taking them throughout this discussion. One thing I wanted to open up to all of you, now that we've sort of established what the issue is, what are we supposed to do as a society and governments with A, the returnees coming from Iraq and Syria, and B, the wave of jihadists that are coming out of prisons across Europe and in North America? And feel free to jump in.
I just want to take on Meredith's point on what could happen if they're repatriated, because obviously in Europe, the sentencing is not at the level it is in the US. So if you arrest someone for terrorism in France or the UK, you can sentence him to 5 years in jail. Within 2.5 years, he's out for good behavior. This doesn't happen in the US. So our legal system is not ready in terms of welcoming those people and sentencing them enough for our security services to be able to face them. Because if we were to repatriate whatever numbers, the 500 figure that I told you would swell to 1,500, and our security services can not have that. To go on your second point, and what I think is critical in terms of the threat is that, unfortunately, it's very difficult because it's a big machine for government to move from the threat of foreign fighters, of returnees, which security services focus so much and didn't really happen the way they expected it to happen, and the problem that we have in the larger society of potentially people just alienated in our society and going and saying, look, I pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi and I'm going to go into a cinema in Paris and kill 15 people. That's the kind of thing that we're seeing, and that security services have switched from the foreign fighters issue to people like this where they have a difficult handle. Last point that I want to put to you is that in our misfortune, we've been extremely lucky that the wave of jihadist attacks that we had in Europe were done by amateurs. Because whether you think that they were extremely well trained in Syria and Iraq and it was the cream of the crop, you look at all the major plots that were successful, from Charlie Hebdo to the November 2015 attack, to Brussels, to even Barcelona, they basically screwed up their plan. I mean, you look at Charlie, they didn't go to the right building at first. They didn't even know where Charlie was. You look at the attack in November 2015 in Paris. They wanted to blow up in the Stade de France, in the football stadium. They didn't buy a ticket to get in. And then the suicide bomber blows himself right outside. He doesn't wait for all the people to come in to kill more fatalities. So I think that the next step is, as we will discuss, the nexus between Islamic State and AQ, Al-Qaeda. The main thing has to do with something extremely powerful in terms of what could happen. And for the first time, MI5 have said that there's a 5% probability that we will get a chemical attack in London. For them to say that is a huge hurdle. And I think that we have to be thinking about what the next step will be.
But I guess one question I have is increased sentencing really going to help when we know that a lot of radicalization and a lot of creating these stronger ties between jihadists happens in prison?
Right, so that's the second conundrum they're looking at. So there were experiences in the UK and France of segregating the people that were sentenced for terrorism so that they don't radicalize others. It's a mixed bag in terms of what happened, because what we had in the past 12 months, if we had in France a lot of radicals attacking their guards, and you had that kind of issue that basically just foster this kind of violence. And at the same time, the prisons are full, it's very expensive, so there needs to be a way to tackle this issue, but you cannot let those people roam free.
Meredith, I could tell you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I would just not disagree with anything Olivier said. A, because I think that's just a good policy in general, but B, because I think that's all right. I do think that also, and if you're looking to interrupt the cycle of violence, you do have to do something that seems difficult, and it's certainly not politically expedient. It's just that the idea that they will either stay in prisons there, they will somehow, the Iraqis and the Syrians will figure this out. They've been asking. I mean, the figures that the Iraqis have asked for to keep foreigners in prison. It's $2 billion or something like that no one is willing to pay for, interested in paying for. Are they going to keep them there indefinitely? They'll get out of prison someday, and then what? So do we think they're going to be further de-radicalized in those prisons? And when they get out, why wouldn't they want to commit attacks against the countries that didn't take them back? Further, if they're not kept in a secure prison and they exit to another country, they could pick up the phone and easily connect with a cell that's back in their home country and facilitate an attack that way. They don't need to be physically in the country to facilitate that. So there's that. But largely, and this could be an entire hour in and of itself, but disrupting the cycle of violence, keeping prisoners there, keeping foreigners there, keeping children without services, without vaccines, without enough food, without education, all we are doing is creating the next generation of the Caliphate.
Casper, I could.
Yeah, quickly, if I might jump in on this point, because I'm glad that Mr. Navarrete will speak last on this, because we're not answering to any bureaucracy or organization, and we're giving advice, and then you have to deal with the reality. So we can kind of freely express opinions on that, and I'm happy I can do that. So I'll say this. I mean, I always got the impression that counterterrorism, we cannot talk about this or that this is what we're going to be doing this year, and we're going to move on to something else next year. That was one of the secretaries the Northern Irish secretaries who was saying, okay, now we're going to start shooting IRA people, and we're going to be shooting more than the previous government. Look where it led. So, I mean, you have to have a full range of options. And I think in this case, Ben, when you're asking, what do we do with the returnees, people going out of jail? I think the bad news is, and this is what Olivier talked about, and also you, Meredith, that you need resources to assess them individually. And when I say full range of options, it starts probably, or it started with kinetic options in the Middle East a couple of years back, going back to the softest of options back here in Europe. And it's a question of, who's who and where, but who makes the call? How do you establish that kind of infrastructure that makes this decision? And it's not just a security infrastructure. just to complicate matters. It must be all the other elements. And I mean, as we implement our projects and we go around Europe, there still, because of that, there's lots of resistance in different countries of, you know, non-security actors to be involved in this process. Saying, oh, it's not us, it's Ministry of Interior. It's not us, it's the security services, it's the police. Well, not really. I mean, we're talking, Meredith, you're talking about vaccines, you know, education, we're talking prisons, you know, there could be so many other sectors of society and actually government that we need to bring together in a sense to make a call about that person or the other person. And if you throw into that kids, well, that again complicates matters even further.
And a lot of this is sort of shrouded in top secrecy in some ways. And I mean, that's sort of the heart of this conversation I think we have to bear in mind is that, you know, returning jihadist fighters, this is actually not a new phenomenon. We've been dealing with this since, you know, time immemorial. And also, there was a high-profile event of it in the 80s with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So this is something I think that's much more nuanced than just to throw one solution at. But one question I wanted to ask you, Manuel, was, you know, for law enforcement, I know in Canada and in the US, although the US is probably the most robust policing of terrorists and bringing them back to, you know, the Southern District of New York to face charges. How hard is it to catch a terrorist and also charge them with a crime?
Well, I think coming back to the discussion that we have, I think there is no simple solution because it's a very complex problem. So sometimes we try to simplify the things in order to give clarity and solution. We don't have a simple solution for that. You can believe in global justice, but then you have to apply individual treatment. Every single country in the European Union, also the US or Australia, Canada, they have their own national legislation to be applied to the individual they are suspected to commit a crime. Then you have to individualize the treatment. I'm speaking from the law enforcement point of view. What kind of crime he or she committed, what kind of evidence that you can gather, what is the cooperation that you have with the countries that where this crime were perpetrated, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, no easy this time. And then you have to try to obtain this evidence and to be proven that could be used in due time in court. It's talking about the criminal, let's say, line of action, which is not easy because we are talking about difficult territory, we're talking about lack evidence, how you respect the chain of custody of the evidence, so it's not really a single solution for that. So the national legislation had to be respected and applied for every single case. At the meantime, I fully agree with what you said. It's not only a law enforcement solution. We are charged to deal with the violence, let's say, area of these people because they pose a risk to the European Union or anywhere else. So we try to assess what kind of indication do we have in order to anticipate the action to happen, in order to prevent this attack to happen. I was mentioned before, we have still attacks in the European Union soil. I'm speaking about European Union mostly. But this year, in 2018, we have more foil attacks. Why? Because we exchange more information. We analyze better the information. We connect the dots fastly and also in a very accurate way. And then we try to prevent this to happen. But every single case had to be analyzed by the intelligence and the law enforcement. So there is no single solution, but many alternatives and a lot of work and commitment from the security and from many areas to prevent this to happen.
Because that's sort of the problem is sometimes, I mean, I've heard this from lawyers as well, that, you know, when a foreign fighter went to Iraq or Syria, they could be there for 3 years. It's a complete blackout on what the person actually did or, you know, of course they probably were part of a group, but how do you convict them on a crime? If they come back and they're tried, a lawyer will say, well, you have no evidence of these crimes. This was completely unknown. So I guess that leads me to another question is, you know, how might de-radicalization programs have been done, I know, in Belgium and in Netherlands, I believe. Yeah. How will those, I mean, what part did they play in this whole debate?
Just a short remark. One of the main sources of evidence is social media monitoring, especially because the terrorists, the foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq, they like to do selfies. They like to show that they are killing people, innocent people also there. This is why it's so important that we have strict cooperation on social media monitoring between the member states, intelligence, and with the provider. I have been proven very, very effective when we are able to identify terrorists before they able to come to any other countries outside Syria or Iraq. So it's quite reinforced. The cooperation that we have in this case is quite relevant. Just the digital footprint is one of the elements that we are focusing now.
Do law enforcement look at it closely enough, do you think?
I think we are, in cooperation with the intelligence service, we are improve the cooperation that we have on these specific profiles, and especially the cooperation with the industry. We have cooperation through the European Union Internet Forum with Google, Twitter, Facebook, Telegram also, try to help us to identify these contents, to remove it by the meantime the person who was behind the content, and also to focus on the propaganda machine. We, in cooperation with the member state, Europol support the takedown of AMAC, the main app for propaganda machine of ISIS. So this is one of the measures that we send. But fighting the propaganda machine, we can fight radicalization.
More broadly, how does the rest of the panel feel about de-radicalization programs?
A huge failure. We've seen it time and again. I mean, you look at what happened in Denmark, in France, in Belgium, in Netherlands. I mean, I've been dealing with jihadists for the past 25 years. I have maybe 4 cases of people that I know personally that had a change of heart. It's extremely difficult when you're in your late 20s to have somebody de-brainstorm you. If it's done at 10, 12 years old, yeah, it's fine. But it has been the main problem, and you see that security services and governments have to deal with a growing number of radicalized individuals. We're talking about 30,000 people, not only in France, but in the UK and Germany, that are potential jihadists on a terror watch list, and 3,000 that are deemed extremely dangerous. And as I said, at any given time, the UK services can follow 50 guys. So we have a huge problem when it comes into getting budget to also education, social, but also to security, because you see when there's an attack, politicians would blame the security services, the police, but they're not giving them any means that they would need in order to fight off. So time and again, we have to see how much of radicalization happens, but also what's happening within the communities in terms of conspiracy theories, for instance. I mean, you go around in some places in France or Belgium, people will tell you that September 11 was not done by Muslim, was not done by Al-Qaeda, but by the Mossad in the US. Still going on, same with Charlie Hebdo. They say, look, of course it's the government. How could the Kouachi brothers could have been so stupid to leave their ID papers in the car? It proves that it's the government. And so this part of the radicalization process is what worries me, and it's what's building the idea of the far right coming in the picture, and building over that, and the potential of putting communities one against the other, and the potential of a civil war in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years.
I actually had a former Al-Qaeda fighter from the US who fought in northern Pakistan on the border of Afghanistan, and he was a 9/11 truther, or is a 9/11 truther. And I was like, what? Of all people, how do you think that, how do you think that way? But I think you're right, there is a lot to do with disinformation that is important in the radicalization process. Go ahead, Meredith.
Well, I think Olivier brought up a lot of really important points. I would say that rather than talk strictly about de-radicalization, I want to bring it back again to this idea of prevention. I don't know what everyone expected. We have such a great full room, and that's wonderful. It says there's a lot of interest in this topic, but I think if there was an idea that there would be a silver bullet, that we'd be able to say what to do or how to do it, and that would be simple, or it's impossible. There is no panacea. My organization is founded by a former FBI special agent, so law enforcement is something we talk about and think about all of the time. That doesn't mean we don't think about and talk about prevention. And so if we don't want to play whack-a-mole with all of the radicalized individuals that Olivier is talking about and that Manuel is talking about, the only way to think about it from my perspective is to be talking simultaneously in these conversations about prevention. And that is a whole of society approach. That's about inclusion, that's about countering the ideology. It's a really important, nuanced, complicated conversation. But certainly, there are some areas where we could start to have agreement, like children. Even if you can't agree on that we'd ever de-radicalize any adult male, the fact that children are wallowing in those camps, it is creating the exact problem we claim we're trying to solve by having them there in the first place. So I think as an international community, and I know there's a lot of talk about tribunals and whether or not there could be, personally, I don't think that would work. The United States getting on board with ideas around capital punishment with some of the European states, we execute minors in the US. There's no way we're gonna have, I'm not advocating for that, but there's simply no way we'd have like a universal idea about how to try and punish people. So I think that that's dead in the water. I think it's a silly idea, but I understand the intention behind it. But there have to be some places we can agree as an international community. I would like to think children is one of them.
And I'll come back to Olivier's point, if I may. Olivier doesn't like de-radicalization. I have problems with some people who write about de-radicalization, because I'm old enough to remember when the business started. It's 15 years ago when Horgan and Bjorgo published their books, Walking Away from Terrorism, disengagement. I prefer disengagement, because it's kind of easier, let's say, to accomplish, to say that I'm no longer going to fight. I can still be the radical that Olivier mentioned. And I remember this started 15 years ago, and this whole cycles of expertise, academia on terrorism studies goes into this kind of fashion. Foreign fighters is the one that is still there, and I'm to blame for that, by the way, because we serve these waves. But the wave of de-radicalization, which is pretty old, like 15 years or more, it's still holding, and we still, as Meredith said, we cannot figure out the kind of the lowest, kind of the low-hanging fruit. And what works, what's applicable, what can we all agree on, and don't just argue about definitions and things like that. But this business is still out there. I think John and Tore kind of like moved on probably after those 15 years, and they look at this multitude of people still fighting over as if in a medieval battle over this terminology. So I find that curious, and there's some quite good minds in the business, yet we still fight over the same battles again and again.
I think prevention seems to be the name of the game. And one thing I think a lot of people can agree on is that individuals who were part of these groups, who do come to the other side, they tend to be very powerful voices in the radical societies where some of these fighters have come from. So that's one thing to think of, but go ahead, Olivier, you wanted to...
So a couple of points to look at is the issue of preventing through a means of radical figures, because you look at a country like the UK, Anjem Choudary, who's been jailed for 5 years and came out after 2.5 years, is one of the leading figures of the jihadist scene that has been able to basically recruit hundreds of people. So what I've always tried to tell, people within the Home Office in terms of what we should be looking at is we are tackling terrorism like the US tackled the war on drugs in the 80s. Basically, we've decided that instead of going after the drug dealer, we're going after the drug user. And the main problem with terrorism is the guy that is basically brainwashing in his mosque 200 people that are going to end up in Syria. And that guy never goes there, never dies there. He just pushes people to blow themselves up, and he lives freely in our countries. So that is one of the aspects that we should be looking at in terms of counterterrorism, is to go after the preachers of hate.
I'm going to turn to some audience questions. Slido. Here's one from Alexandra. Sending people to the camps back, should we do this? Research by GLOBSEC shows that it is a second generation of immigrants who are prone to radicalization. Is that, do we allow them to come back even though that's a possibility?
I think the larger point is we're not keeping ourselves safe by keeping them there. It's a naive proposition to think that if you keep foreigners right now in sort of jails in Syria and camps in Syria and, you know, jails in Iraq, many of which are secret, that's going to somehow actually keep us safer. The way ideology works is you can't possibly arrest all the people who support the ideology. So as to first or second generation or who they are, I think the main, and if this is your study, you can talk more specifically about it, but I think the main point is what's going to work broadly across the board, like thematically, and is there any reason to think that you're not creating more supporters of the Islamic State by the policies in the home countries, by the policies that you're following right now or lack of policy in Iraq and Syria. So it's about thinking about the big picture. It's thinking about the long term, where we think it's a short-term security gain at best. It is not a long-term solution to keep them there.
Probably in terms of, do we bring in some of them, I mean, do we bring them back? Like I said before, some of them probably yes. And I mean, especially kids. Well, I mean, they're not fighters. So I mean, that's, or some actually were. So that complicates this further. But it is to be decided, I think, on an individual basis. Let's not have this. You know, we have to also understand the implications that, you know, if Iraq, for example, sentences, and it did already, these individuals to death, and there's already a human rights pushback, which I treat with a bit of irony, you know, in this situation, that okay, but these are, you know, citizens of our states. We should have the capability to actually process them through our, you know, through our system. Some people say that, you know, I'm not, you know, that's why I'm saying let's bring some back. Let's not bring them en masse. You know, I'm not speaking for such a deal. And in terms of the generations, you know, yes, second generation, but then again, in countries like Italy, they're mostly first generation. They arrived very recently. They don't yet have the roots there that much. That's why Italy, while defending against this threat, has this approach of, you know, quick deportation. Why can't they deport them? Because they only have Moroccan, Tunisian, Egyptian citizenship. They're not Italians. So, you know, you've got spots of first generation as well, and you've got spots of third, fourth. I mean, when we get to the sixth, will we drop this point? Again, I'm feeling like we're kind of flogging, maybe not a dead horse, but the one that's very tired.
And there's also just been, I mean, to look at some of the fighters who've gone over from Canada, just, you know, French-Canadian guys who are seventh generation French-Canadian. So this is something that, I mean, there's a lot of different types that have gone over, to reiterate that point. Another question from Hans, will we see a convergence of the Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State support networks in Europe since there was already mutual operational support for the attacks?
Yes, we've seen time and again that they work together fine, but on the lower level rather than on the strategic level. I think that the main issue has to do with ego. I mean, when you're looking at terrorist groups, you know, I come from the corporate world, and I analyze terrorist group as corporations because they all have a means basically to make money. The way they make money is by getting their return on investment on their attacks, but also they look at mergers and acquisitions, literally. And they think that, look, the model of Islamic State worked fine. And if you look at it, you have a dichotomy between the Al-Qaeda model and Islamic State. I always call the Islamic State the McDonald's of terrorism. Basically, you just come in, you order what you want, you join, nobody asks you anything, you pay, and you leave. Al-Qaeda is a very elitist organization. It's a top-down, you have to be vetted, and that's where they made the mistake. And when people say, look, the Islamic State is dead, yes, but the genius of Baghdadi was to announce the Caliphate. Because even if the physical Caliphate has been removed, in the minds of a lot of people, the Caliphate was there. And Al-Qaeda was never, ever thinking about getting and announcing the Caliphate until they would rule all over. So yes, we've already seen that, you know, some of Al-Qaeda members have moved to Islamic State, but on the lower level. In terms of the ego of the leaders, this will never happen, the kind of merger that we can see in the corporate world.
Yeah, very briefly to complement what you said, I mean, we cannot assess that this group, they are like an army. They say, okay, people from Al-Qaeda on the left, people from Islamic State on the right. It's not working like that. I mean, at the end, there are different models of terrorism. They have different motives. They are aiming somehow different targets, but at the meantime, they are sharing some common points when we speak about terrorist causes and terrorist activity. Some of the groups that they were initially labeled as Islamic State, now they became affiliated to Al-Qaeda, and the other way around. So there is a communication, because at the end, they are a local adaptability. And now, as you say, now we see, especially there is a controversy on social media that Islamic State Caliphate, virtual Caliphate, is going down. They have not the capability to export more propaganda. They are not really able to export this wonderful image that they have killing people. So they are going down, and Al-Qaeda still remain. So now Al-Qaeda leaders say, so who was wiser? It was you that you was selling McDonald's, or the one I was selling terrorists of quality, who is now still standing up? So, but this is not helping the security. So because we have a competition with the terrorists, which is never good for the security.
This competition breeds stronger outcome. Well, I mean, also, that's the thing too. I don't think ISIS is not gone. I mean, they're in Congo, new place that they've recently done some attacks, and it was interesting for the people who watch, who are like us, who watch terrorist things closely. When you had the image of Zawahiri whenever he crawled out of wherever he is and would say something to a camera, he just looked so boring and just not very flashy. And then all of a sudden you see a ISIS video, and it was like a first-person shooter video game, and just sort of completely shows the two differences and the approach of the groups, albeit they are very similar. Is ISIS rethinking its strategy in Europe now that its fighters are captives in Iraq?
If I may, Ben, maybe just on the previous point as well. I mean, it's a controversial thing to say on stage at GLOBSEC, but let's give more credit to Mr. Zawahiri, because he's been in the business for 50 years. And, it's kind of, I know books are passé, and, glasses are passé, and, but then you kind of like, he's been around for 50 years. He's been, he's the one shouting from the cage in early 80s in this trial, and he's still there. I don't know if he commands 5 people or 500 people, but, is there, in terms of maybe just coming back to, these questions are interconnected in a sense, the strategies and Al-Qaeda, ISIS, I think I get a sense that I'm probably too old to study this, because for young people it's easy to kind of shift allegiances to kind of like, in a postmodern world. And I can't, if you're left, then you cannot be right. And when a question is Al-Qaeda, ISIS, as we heard, it's really a flow. I mean, when I spoke to a guy far left who fought in Ukraine on the pro-Russian, let's say, separatist side, and I spoke to him, said, hey, there were French neo-Nazis next to you in the trench. Did you have a problem with that? He says, no, I mean, absolutely okay. Far left, far right, we're together, and we're going to shoot at the real enemy. I mean, we can discuss who the real enemy was. And I think it applies to other ideologies in this sense. And whether, the question, the Iraqi segment, are they changing? Of course. Because I think, Ben, it's a fantastic, it's a recruiting sergeant in a way that you've got stories of people who are now in these camps, who are mistreated by justice in Iraq and Syria. They're Europeans, and I would love to see a study on how that plays in the European fanboy, so to speak, networks of ISIS. Is this resonating? So it's no longer a glorious story. I went, I fought, and I won. It's a story of failure. It's a story of oppression. It's a story of like, mistreatment. I'd love to see a study on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a guy from Canada who I remember I was texting with him when he was fighting for ISIS, and he was always, out of all the people I spoke to, he was like the person who scared me the most in terms of, I knew he was involved with some really serious people who were fighting there. Anyways, then fast forward 4 years, and he's begging to come back, and he's renouncing the whole thing. He said, I was misled. But then, I mean, if I'm security services, is he telling the truth? Is it right? But he switched his allegiances just like that. And it was always the person I thought who was the most hardcore. So, I mean, I agree with you. One question on the extreme right wing in Europe, and I want to modify, because I think it's an important question I think we need to address here as we're talking about the threat of terrorism in Europe and in North America. And we like to focus very much so on Islamic extremism. But, through my own reporting, I'm seeing the way that, these far-right groups are mimicking Al-Qaeda and ISIS, both in propaganda and in structure. And they're now, we saw a very horrific attack by an amateur in Christchurch, New Zealand, that was very effective for their movement. I mean, how do you see both the threat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and the far right in Europe? Do you see them as similar?
Well, I think that Casper's been studying this a lot longer than I have, but no, it is certainly something that we are looking at the ways in which the networking is quite similar. I would just say, to sort of tie something I wanted to say before to this, for people on the ground, for people who are joining up with these different groups, sometimes it's a matter of expediency, especially in a place like Yemen or in the Sahel, where depending on which group gives credibility to your struggle, you sign on with their ideology. I don't know that it's vastly different than what's happening in the white nationalism, neo-Nazi, white supremacist space. I think that we are certainly seeing the ways in which ideology, first and foremost, regardless of which ideology you subscribe to, if it's an extremist ideology, it's attracting the same kind of person. And so I think that in terms of something that my center is working on is a mapping of the ways in which the networks between the global jihadi movement and the white nationalist movement are similar. But I think that we can also say that that it's a space that in the United States anyway, we're trying desperately to have government look more carefully at, because you talk to any FBI, I mean, they are out on this 100%. The threat is domestic terrorism, and by that they mean white nationalist and white supremacist, overwhelmingly by the numbers. And they testify in Congress to this effect. There was recently in the House Foreign Affairs Committee, there was a hearing on international terrorism where for the first time they wanted to elevate the threat of white nationalism along with Salafi jihadism and Shia terrorism, to make sure that the US government is looking at them all as a serious threat, both to the United States and globally.
I'll just say, in terms of, I'd love to ask Manuel this question. Like, probably you will not put a percentage on this, but you had you have the Counterterrorism Center. And is this creeping up? If you could break it, okay, so that much time is on this, and that much time is on the other guys, whoever they are. Because I think we're sometimes dumbing it down when you say white, far right, neo-Nazi, because it's such a mess. It's so postmodern, and some of them would probably be offended by being called far right, and the real far right would be offended that they're called far right, and it really goes in circles. But I think, let's be honest, the classic of the genre, Bruce Hoffman wrote that far right guys in terms of terrorism, they were actually the ones who implemented first certain innovations. We talk a lot about social media for ISIS and the usage of internet and na. Well, these guys were pioneering this when hardly anyone had a computer. So you're looking at an adaptable network which does not have those standout organizations, or maybe it does. Atomwaffen Division in the United States. So it's no longer just individuals. You have strong ties of brotherhood amongst them, and this kind of omerta, that I'm not gonna actually denounce you to the police. I might not be doing this with you, wink wink, but I can put you up for the night and stuff. There is, it's a cliche to say there is a network. There is a community of these guys, and I think what saves us from tragedy is that sometimes I get the feeling that the community is pretty confused as to who the enemy is and how to strike against that enemy, sometimes. But I'm not sure, I think we're living on a borrowed time in this sense.
I pretty much agree with what you said. I think we are talking about two different phenomena, violent phenomena, but logically the intelligence service, the law enforcement, the judiciary, and therefore Europol is focusing on the more aggressive one. And during the last 5 years, the most sophisticated attack was connected to so-called religion-inspired terrorism, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State. So therefore, the security forces try to focus on this specific area without, let's say, only focusing on this specific area, because we know that the other phenomena have to be monitored. The activity connected to so-called violent red wing, we have observed an increase during the last years. It's not comparable what we have now connected to the religion-inspired terrorism, but it's true that we have more cases and more action come from the member states to identify this threat and to mitigate the threat. But the profile is different. They are most isolated people. They can become quite sophisticated, and in the meantime, they are imitating, as you very well said, some of the dynamic that we have seen in Al-Qaeda on Islamic State. You see the attack in New Zealand, where they were broadcasting live the attacks, killing the people in the mosque, but also they prepared a manifesto as they're connected to the Templars. So there is some similarities, even to the case that we have a few years ago, Breivik case. So there is a imitation game on this specific phenomenon because they see as a reference to commit the attack. But I think we are talking about two different phenomena, but at the meantime, they are receiving treatment from the law enforcement, intelligence, and judicial. So it's true they are not at the same level, but they still are focused. They are one of the area of activity of the counter-terrorist activity in the European Union for sure, and also in the US.
Yeah, it was yesterday I saw on a social media site that frequents a lot of white nationalist terrorists, or white nationalist terrorist groups. There was an image of a guy in Norway, had a knife, pointing at this thing called Siege by James Mason, which is, something else. They have Bibles too, like manifesto Bibles. This is Norway. This is a country you don't really think this is going to happen in, but it does, and this is something that, and it did. And you getting back to your Adam Waffen point, that was a group that was quite successful in the way that it got attention in the United States, but also has since inspired several different chapters within Europe, both places like Germany, the UK, and also the Baltics. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on. I think it's important that we kind of mention it. I'm going to turn back to another question from the audience. Is the situation in the Western Balkan countries regarding Islam radicalization worse than in other parts of Europe?
That's a good question, and that makes me think about a point that I didn't make, and that I think is important. So I'll answer the question, whoever asked the question, I'll answer the question, but just one point is that recently, when we looked at threat assessment within Europe, because of what we said with Emmanuel, that security services in the West have been extremely good at foiling attacks in the past few years. For me, in terms of what I see as the major risk would be, for instance, an attack on Prague. Because you don't think about the Czech Republic as being possibly hit by an attack, but it has the hallmarks of lazy jihadists that do not want to make it difficult to try to attack London or Paris. An attack on the Charles Bridge in August, killing American tourists, British tourists. There's a huge Jewish presence in Prague. So for me, looking at where the threat is going to move, I think the Central and Eastern Europe and the Balkans are the next threat in terms of what we can see. So to answer the question, yes, in terms of radicalization, we've seen from Kosovo and also in Bosnia a lot of foreign fighters. We've seen, which is interesting, is how much there's a fight for the hearts and mind of, for instance, Bosnian Muslims between Saudi and Iran. And they keep on throwing money at radicals, and that's one of the aspects that I've seen time and again at the EU. Some of the services, including the Italians, are putting the Western Balkans as the #1 threat in terms of terrorism.
But if you're asking people on the ground in the Western Balkans, they're worried about far-right extremists. I mean, they're not talking about the jihadi threat. There is a deep concern about this other problem that we absolutely should be talking about in tandem with this. that, people are very clear about their concerns. We've been doing a lot of work on the ground there, and so it's important to remember that as well.
Yeah, and I think also, if you look at some of the political groups in Europe, some of them are attracting these individuals, right? And some of these opinions are getting more mainstream, and I think especially when it comes from this white nationalist standpoint. But at the same time, there's also a theater that's had links to Al Qaeda in the past. The other thing we haven't discussed is you also have Russia that has dealt with both of these issues very closely, and you have Chechnya not very far away. And Chechnya has been some of the militants that have come out of there have been the most active in global jihadist movements. Here's another question, and I like this one. Why do amateur jihadists attack rather than letting professionals do the job? What holds them back? Are they afraid of anything? I mean, go ahead, Casper.
You work with what you've got to some extent, really, and I mean that's what Olivier has been talking about. That going maybe back to President Obama's point that this whoever wears the Lakers shirt is not essentially Kobe Bryant, and he meant ISIS, but then okay. And then it was okay, then vice versa. So I guess it's a similar situation in this sense. That's the very last line of defense, that they are amateurs, that they're gonna really it's gonna be a flop. But I mean, I always pinch myself whenever there is an amateur, because they're not all amateurs, and some of the things they're able to achieve, maybe not in terms of lethality. Some of the things that they were, organizationally in terms of preparation, some of that actually is quite impressive, and really, I wouldn't discount it all. But I mean, you work with what you've got, and if the classic jihadi that we've got in our sample is hardly at high school, hardly finishes 2-3 classes of high school, well, they might lack certain, I wouldn't say education or job-like qualities, but I mean, I would say they lack certain skills that they could actually turn them into more successful attackers.
I would raise one point here is looking at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was from far the most sophisticated attack since Mumbai. I mean, and the reason why, not only that they were under the radar and there was problems within the domestic government, but also the access to cash. Because compared to the profile of Europeans, those were top-notch. They were from the wealthiest Muslim families on the island. And a figure that struck me after the attack is that the Sri Lankan government was able to freeze $40 million from those guys that was deemed to help them foster attack. When you know that 9/11 cost $500,000, 40 million, you can do a lot. So in this case, they were not amateur, and we've seen how good they were. The last thing that I want to mention compared to the question is, amateurs can create a lot of problems for us. Imagine if within the next 2 weeks, each day we get an attack in London, in Paris, in Brussels, just a guy walking into a bakery, blowing himself up, is just an amateur, but they know each other. Imagine the impact on the economy. You will stop going to restaurants, to cinemas, to all that if it were just low, sophisticated attacks. And that's what exactly the Algerian jihadists behind the Lyon attack, they asked him, why did you attack in that street in front of the bakery? He said, I wanted to attack a place that was extremely usual, that people would not think would be attacked. And that's where they're dangerous.
Yeah, I think that Sri Lanka attack was like a throwback Al Qaeda cell. It was all these rich kids, and they effectively undertook it. And I should add too, in where I'm from, in Canada, you had a completely amateur guy walk into our parliament and shoot a gun off, and he only killed one person, but it completely changed the way terrorism was viewed in Canada up until that point. It had been, almost a decade since, or I think more than a decade since 9/11, and that was the first time someone had done something. So, do you want to go ahead, Manuel?
Yeah, I want to just say something about that. I mean, there is clear correlation between organizational issues. I mean, you are connected to organization, then you have a kind of apparatus, a logistic apparatus. You also can obtain a lot of funding. Then you need more time to prepare your plan. Then you spend some time on communication, you spend some time on acquiring the weapons or the explosive, and then you commit the attack. So it's clearly that the more sophisticated you are, the more lethal you can become. This is why the attack in Paris, in Brussels, the more time you have to prepare, the more possibility that you have to acquire proper weapons or explosive, even going beyond the classical one, then you can cause more victims. So the impact is very high. But in the meantime, the good news is that you need more time to do so. You need more people to do so. You need more communication to do so. So the chances for the security service to spot this and to deter, delay, even prevent it, they are higher. But we are not in this line, then the consequences are very high. Going in the direction to these individual actors. They are not sophisticated, and they have to be very lucky to commit the attack. But in the meantime, they can be very, very also lethal. You have to remember the Nice case. Like one guy with the truck, and the celebration of the French Day, they killed more than 80 people. The sophisticated attacks, you need time, you need money, you need a lot of resources, you need time. And then you became a little bit predictable. Being predictable, you can be preventable. If you go to the long actor attacks, you need less time, you need less means, and you only want to select one target and go for it. So they are more unpredictable, and therefore they are less difficult to prevent. But this is the equation they are working at the security level.
So we'll go one last question, and it's on something I think we haven't really touched on. We often hear individuals are groomed into joining ISIS, terminology associated with sexual exploitation. How useful or unhelpful is this in explaining engagement, or in, I think, maybe explaining how people get attracted or stay?
Yeah, and I'd gladly. Actually, good question. The academic in me and the researcher in me says whatever new take on this could help us in actually understanding the organization and its mode of operation. I wouldn't discount usage of something from a completely different discipline. I mean, I've seen it work. We've all seen it work, or not work as well. Let's be honest. But I wouldn't discount it. Whether actually this one, I mean, I'm not knowledgeable about this at all. I mean, in terms of like what we see, I mean, I wouldn't say exploitation. What we see in our sample is really people having, I mean, it might sound controversial, but quite a lot of them really do have issues and problems in childhood, during their childhoods. And of course, this is just one variable. There's so many others. But, broken homes, traumas, even, kind of like some kind of traumatic in their mind quite often, situations from school. I'm not saying that this should be the compass for us now, but when you see a lot of stuff like that, and there's a book on that coming up, that basically if you're from a kind of like an abusive home, then you are more likely to become a terrorist. That, I mean, I'm dumbing it down. I'm not gonna advertise the outer. As I'm saying, this is just one variable. But if you see it, if you use this one and many others, there might, but I just say might, not might be something to it.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. I mean, maybe vulnerable to manipulation is how I would put it, as opposed to exploitation. And there's going to be, I think we were talking about this last night, but there's always going to be a percentage of people who are drawn to violence. No matter what you do in the world is a violent place. There will always be violent conflict. I think one of the main mistakes that countries have made is to present to their citizens as if they can keep them completely safe all the time. It's just untrue. It's simply not true. So, and we were talking about this. Olivier, you said something about security services don't get credit for what they do. And I did say this last night. When we get asked by governments in ad hoc conversations, well, how do we convince our population to do, that we need to take people back, or that we need to, engage in preventative activities, I say, I understand how difficult it is for you, because if you make a mistake, if you screw up, it is on the front page of the news. But for all of the wonderful things that you do, for all of the things that you prevent, it's not on the front page every day. So to bring it back to this particular topic, there's always going to be violence. There's always going to be people drawn to violent conflict. But the opportunity to join a global organization that's, presenting itself as an antithesis to corruption and to American domination and all of the other winning strategies that ISIS especially has had, is a new opportunity. We can compare it to the Soviet jihad. We can compare it to a lot of things. There's been nothing on the scale of this that the world has seen in modern memory. And so it is very complicated, and maybe this is a point to end, but that's why the solution is so complicated. When people talk about, oh, well, let's take lessons from gang violence and let's use them in de-radicalization or in thinking about how to deal with ISIS fighters, or let's talk about what happened with the FARC in Colombia. When you talked about children, nobody would suggest taking child soldiers who fought with the LRA in Uganda and locking them up in a prison for 20 years. That wasn't the global conversation. But what it means to be part of ISIS in the minds of people is so different that it's impossible for us to sort of use the old formulas in how we think about them.
That's a good way to end it, because I think for the first time ever, once ISIS came into the game, it was like it became synonymous with evil, like Nazi regime was, even more so than Al Qaeda, which is there's some sort of cultural phenomenon that happened for that to happen. Well, now that we've solved all of the world's de-radicalization, jihadist problem, terrorism problem, I think it's a great time to end this panel. And thank you very much for being here.